The war chamber of the Galactic Council was a place where empires were made and broken, where species that had ruled the stars for 10,000 years gathered to decide the fate of lesser worlds. And on this day, 12 of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy had come together for one purpose: to divide the territory of humanity among themselves like wolves sharing a fresh kill. Commander Ilara Vance walked into that chamber alone, her boots clicking against the polished floor that reflected the light of a dozen alien suns streaming through the massive windows above. And every eye in the room turned to watch her enter. Some with curiosity, most with contempt, and a few with something that looked almost like pity. She was small by the standards of this room, standing barely 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to take in everything while giving away nothing at all. The simple gray uniform of the Terran Defense Force, no medals on her chest, no weapons at her hip, nothing that would mark her as anything special among the giants and monsters that filled this space. The Kethvari delegation sat to her left, 7 insectoid creatures that stood over 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in chitinous armor, the color of dried blood, their mandibles clicking in a rhythm that she had learned long ago was their version of laughter. And their leader, Ambassador Vrex, watched her with compound eyes that held no warmth, no respect, only the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey that had wandered too close. "The Terran Confederacy sends a single female," Vrex chittered, his voice carrying across the chamber through the translation devices embedded in every seat. "One who carries no weapons and wears no rank of importance. And we are supposed to believe they take these negotiations seriously?" Laughter rippled through the chamber, deep and rumbling from the Iroth Dominion's massive warlords, hissing and sharp from the serpentine Velathine hegemony, clicking and buzzing from a dozen other species who had come to feast on humanity's weakness. Ilara said nothing as she walked to the small table that had been set aside for the Terran delegation, a table that was noticeably smaller than all the others, placed at the far end of the room where she would have to crane her neck to see the main speakers. And she sat down in her chair with her hands folded on her lap, her face as calm and unreadable as a statue carved from stone. Lieutenant James Chen, her aide, stood behind her, with sweat already forming on his brow, his eyes darting nervously around the room as he took in the size and power of the beings that surrounded them. And he leaned down to whisper in her ear with a voice that shook slightly despite his best efforts to control it. "Commander, perhaps we should say something to establish our position, to show them that humanity will not simply accept whatever terms they dictate to us." Ilara did not turn to look at him, did not change her expression in any way, and simply replied in a voice so quiet that only he could hear. "Not yet." Warlord Grin of the Urath Dominion rose from his seat, a massive creature that stood nearly 9 feet tall and was covered in thick gray fur, with fangs that jutted from his lower jaw and eyes that burned with the fire of a species that had conquered 100 worlds through blood and violence. And he spread his arms wide as he addressed the chamber. "Let us not waste time on pleasantries that none of us feel," he growled, his voice like thunder rolling across mountains. "We all know why we are here, and the human delegation knows it as well, even if they lack the courage to speak of it openly." He pointed one clawed finger at Ilara, who sat motionless in her chair at the far end of the room. "Humanity has expanded beyond their means, reached too far into space that they cannot hold, claimed worlds that they cannot defend, and now the time has come for the natural order to be restored," he declared, and murmurs of agreement rose from the assembled delegates. "Their fleet is small, their technology is primitive compared to our own, and they have no allies who would risk war to protect them. Counselor Mythos of the Velethine hegemony uncoiled her serpentine body from her seat, her scales gleaming like polished emeralds in the light, her forked tongue flicking out to taste the air, as she added her voice to the chorus. The hegemony has long watched humanity spread across the stars like a disease, breeding and multiplying at a rate that threatens to upset the balance of power that has existed for millennia. She hissed, her words dripping with venom, both literal and figurative. It is time to contain this infection before it grows beyond our ability to control. More voices joined in, species adding their grievances against humanity to the growing list. Complaints about trade disputes and border incidents and diplomatic slights both real and imagined. And through it all, Ilara sat in silence, her eyes moving slowly around the room, watching faces and reading body language that most humans would never notice. She saw the way Ambassador Vrex's antennae twitched whenever Warlord Grin spoke, a subtle sign of irritation that the Kethvari tried to hide but could not fully suppress. And she noticed how Counselor Mythos kept her distance from the Urath delegation, her tail curling away from them, as if she feared contamination from their presence. These were not allies united by common cause, she realized, but rivals who had temporarily set aside their hatred of each other, because their hatred of humanity was slightly greater. And that was information she could use when the time was right. Lieutenant Chen bent down again, his whisper more urgent now as the attacks against humanity grew more vicious, and the proposed divisions of Terran space grew more extreme. Commander, they are talking about turning our colonies into labor camps, about using our people for medical experiments, about things that I cannot even repeat, and you just sit there saying nothing at all? Ilara finally turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, and what he saw there made him take a step back in surprise, because behind that calm exterior was something sharp and dangerous, something that had been watching and waiting and calculating every moment since she walked through the door. They expect me to beg, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed impossible for someone her size. They expect me to plead for mercy and offer concessions and show them the fear that they believe all humans feel when faced with superior power. And that expectation is the first weapon I will use against them. Face the chamber, her hands still folded peacefully on her lap, her expression still as unreadable as it had been when she first sat down. Let them mock, let them laugh, let them believe that my silence means I have already accepted defeat, because every word they speak, every gesture they make, every glance they exchange with each other is telling me exactly how to tear their little coalition apart from the inside. And so, Commander Ilara Vance sat quietly in the war chamber of the Galactic Council, while 12 species decided the fate of humanity. And not a single one of them understood that the most dangerous person in the room was the small human woman who had not yet spoken a word. The hours passed slowly in the war chamber, each minute feeling like an eternity, as the alien delegates argued and shouted, and made grand speeches about the crimes of humanity and the justice of their cause. And through it all, Ilara remained in her seat like a statue carved from ice, watching and listening and storing every piece of information in a mind that had been trained for exactly this kind of warfare. Ambassador Vrex of the Kethvari had proposed that human colonies in the northern sectors be turned over to his people for biological research. A phrase that made Lieutenant Chen's face go pale when he heard it, because everyone in the galaxy knew what Kethvari biological research really meant, and the screams of their test subjects were set to echo through their laboratory ships for years after death finally claimed them. The humans breed quickly and adapt to many environments, Vrex clicked, his mandible spreading in what passed for a smile among his kind. They will make excellent subjects for our experiments, and their genetic diversity will provide us with data that could advance our sciences by centuries. The Iraf Dominion demanded the mineral-rich worlds along humanity's western border, planets that contained rare elements essential for building faster-than-light drives, and Warlord Grin made it clear that any humans currently living on those worlds would be given a simple choice: work in the mines until they died, or be removed in a manner that he did not bother to specify. The Velathine hegemony wanted control of human trade routes, the shipping lanes that connected Earth to its colonies. And Counselor Mythis spoke at length about how her people would manage the flow of goods and people, taking a generous cut of everything that moved through what had once been free space. Smaller species made smaller demands, each one carving off a piece of humanity's future like diners at a feast, and not a single voice in that chamber spoke up to defend the rights of the billions of humans whose lives were being decided without their consent. Lieutenant Chen could barely contain himself, his hands shaking as he listened to each new horror that was proposed, and he bent down to whisper to Alara for what must have been the 20th time that day. "Commander, this is madness, and we cannot simply sit here while they plan the enslavement of our entire species," he hissed, his voice cracking with barely controlled emotion. "We have to do something, say something, anything at all." Alara's eyes never stopped moving, tracking the subtle interactions between the delegates that most people would miss entirely. The way the Yirith warlord's fur bristled slightly whenever the Kethvari ambassador spoke too long. The way the Velathine counselor's tongue flicked with irritation when the smaller species dared to make demands of their own. "Tell me what you see, Lieutenant," she said quietly, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. Chen blinked in confusion, not understanding what she was asking, or why she would ask it at such a moment. "I see a room full of monsters who want to destroy everything we have built," he replied bitterly. "Look again," Ilara instructed. "Look at the way they watch each other, not the way they watch us, and tell me what you see." Chen forced himself to take a breath and look at the chamber with fresh eyes, trying to see what his commander saw, and slowly, like a picture coming into focus, he began to notice things that had escaped his attention before. The Kethvari and the Yirath never looked directly at each other, their delegates positioned on opposite sides of the room, as if proximity itself was dangerous, and when one spoke, the other's body language shifted in ways that spoke of deep and ancient hatred barely held in check. The Velathine hegemony watched everyone with suspicion, serpentine eyes, never resting on any single target for long, as if they expected an attack to come from any direction at any moment. And their demands for trade routes had clearly angered several smaller species who relied on those same lanes for their own commerce. "They hate each other," Chen breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They came here to destroy us, but they hate each other almost as much as they hate humanity." "Not almost," Alara corrected him, a ghost of a smile crossing her face for just a moment before vanishing like smoke. "They hate each other far more than they hate us, because we are new and small and easy to dismiss. But they have been fighting each other for thousands of years, and wounds that old do not heal simply because a new enemy appears." She finally shifted in her seat, leaning back slightly, as if settling in for a long wait. The Kethvari and the Yirath fought 3 wars in the last millennium alone. Last one ended with the Kethvari deploying a biological weapon on an Yirath colony world that killed 2 million civilians, she said, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge that had taken years to gather. The official records say it was an accident, a natural plague that happened to appear at a convenient time, but I have seen the classified communications that prove otherwise. Chen stared at her with wide eyes, unable to believe what he was hearing. The Velathine hegemony signed a secret treaty with the previous Yirath warlord, promising to help him overthrow his own government in exchange for territorial concessions. Ilara continued, "Warlord Grin knows about that treaty because I made sure he found out about it 6 months ago through channels he believes are completely secure." "You planned this," Chen whispered, his voice filled with equal parts horror and awe. "You knew they would call this council, and you have been preparing for it all." Ilara did not confirm or deny his accusation. but the look in her eyes was answer enough. Humanity has been part of the galactic community for only 200 years, and in that time, we have been dismissed and ignored, and treated as children playing at being adults, she said, her voice harder now, carrying an edge that Chen had never heard before. But children watch and listen and learn, Lieutenant, and we have learned a great deal about our neighbors while they were busy looking down on us. She nodded toward the chamber, where the arguments were growing more heated as the delegates began to realize that they could not all have what they wanted. Every species in this room has secrets they would kill to protect, alliances they have betrayed, atrocities they have committed and blamed on others. And humanity has spent 2 centuries collecting those secrets like precious gems, Alara explained. We may not have the biggest fleet or the most advanced technology, but we have gathered intelligence that none of you could imagine. Weapons. But we have something far more dangerous. What is that? Chen asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer even as he spoke. Memory, Alara replied simply. We remember everything they have done, everything they have said, everything they have tried to hide. And today, I'm going to remind them why that should terrify them. She turned her attention back to the chamber, where Ambassador Vrex was now shouting at Warlord Grin about the proposed division of territories. Their carefully maintained alliance already beginning to crack under the weight of their own greed and suspicion. But not yet, she added quietly. First, I'm going to let them tear themselves apart a little more, because the longer they fight among themselves, the easier my job becomes. And so she sat quietly for another hour, watching the coalition that had come to destroy humanity begin to devour itself. And she smiled a small private smile that none of them were. Close enough to see. By the 6th hour of the council session, the cracks in the coalition had grown into fractures that threatened to split it apart entirely, and Alara watched with satisfaction as the delegates who had come to destroy humanity began to turn on each other with increasing venom and hostility. Ambassador Vrex had demanded that the Kethvari receive first choice of human colonies, claiming that his people had been the ones to call the council together and therefore deserved the greatest rewards. And this claim had enraged Warlord Grin beyond all measure. The Kethvari have done nothing but talk and scheme from the shadows, while the Dominion has actually fought humanity in battle, Grin roared, slamming his massive fist on the table, hard enough to crack the polished surface. It was Yirath blood that was spilled when the humans defended their colony at New Singapore, and it should be Yirath ships that claim the spoils of our coming victory. Your precious warriors were defeated by a species you call primitive and weak. Vrex shot back, his mandibles clicking with undisguised contempt. Perhaps if the Dominion spent less time boasting about their strength and more time actually winning battles, they would have something to show for their efforts. The insult landed like a physical blow, and Grin's fur stood on end, as a growl built deep in his massive chest, a sound that made several smaller delegates edge away from his vicinity with fear written clearly on their faces. Counselor Mythos saw an opportunity, and slithered into the growing gap between the 2 larger powers, her voice smooth and reasonable in contrast to the raw anger that filled the chamber. Perhaps we should focus on what unites us rather than what divides us, she suggested, though Alara noticed that her eyes gleamed with satisfaction at the conflict she was witnessing. The humans are the enemy here, not each other, and we accomplish nothing by fighting among ourselves. Easy words from a species that plans to profit from our conquests without risking a single ship in battle, snapped a delegate from the Marathi collective, a smaller species of pale-skinned humanoids who had been largely ignored throughout the session. The Velathine want to control trade routes that others will die to secure, and they offer nothing in return but empty promises. How dare you speak to us in such a manner? Mythos hissed, her scales flushing a deeper shade of green that indicated rising anger. The Marathi are here only because we allowed it, and you would do well to remember your place. Our place? The Marathi delegate shouted, rising from his seat, with fists clenched at his sides. Our people have been subjugated by the hegemony for 300 years, forced to pay tribute and bow to your ambassadors. And now you tell us to remember our place, while you claim the greatest prizes for yourselves? Old grudges and fresh insults combined into a storm of accusations that bounced from delegation to delegation, each species finding reasons to attack their supposed allies and defend their own interests against the encroaching greed of others. Lieutenant Chen watched the spectacle with his mouth hanging open, unable to believe that the mighty coalition that had seemed so terrifying just hours ago was now tearing itself apart over questions of who would get the biggest share of a conquest they had not yet achieved. "Commander," he breathed, leaning close to Alara's ear, "this is incredible. But I do not understand how you knew this would happen, how you could predict that they would destroy themselves like this." Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the arguing delegates, tracking each exchange and filing away every piece of information for future use. "It was not difficult to predict," she replied quietly, "because this is what always happens when predators try to cooperate. And every species in this room is a predator at heart, evolved to take what they want by force and cunning rather than sharing with others." She nodded toward the Kethvari and Urath delegations, who were now exchanging insults that bordered on declarations of war. They formed this coalition because they saw humanity as easy prey, a target so weak that they could afford to set aside their hatred long enough to feast on our remains, she explained. But now they are faced with the reality of actually dividing the spoils, and their true nature is emerging. "Greed," Chen said, understanding dawning on his face. "Greed, yes, but also fear," Ilara added, "because each of them knows that any power gained by their rivals is power that could be used against them in the future, and none of them trust each other enough to accept anything less than the largest share." She turned slightly to look at her aide, and there was something in her eyes that made him shiver despite the warmth of the chamber. "Humans are different, Lieutenant, and that is why they have always underestimated us," she said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the space between them. "We evolved as pack hunters, creatures who learned that cooperation was the key to survival, that sharing with the tribe was more important than hoarding for ourselves. We are not perfect," she continued, "and we have our own history of greed and conflict and betrayal, but when we face a common enemy, we can set aside our differences in ways that these species cannot even imagine, and that ability is worth more than all their ships and weapons combined." The argument in the chamber had reached a fever pitch, with Ambassador Vrex now openly threatening to withdraw the Kethvari from the coalition if their demands were not met, and Warlord Grin responding with promises of violence that made several delegates flee the room entirely. Ilara said, more to herself than to Chen, "A few more minutes, and they will be ready to hear what I have to say." Chen stared at her with something approaching reverence, realizing for the first time just how outmatched he was in this game of strategy and manipulation. "How long have you been planning this, Commander?" he asked. Ilara smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth, but carried a hint of something that might have been satisfaction. "I was recruited by Terran intelligence when I was 17 years old, and they saw something in me that I did not yet see in myself," she replied. "For the past 15 years, I have done nothing but study our enemies, learn their secrets, and wait for the moment when that knowledge would become useful." She rose from her chair for the first time in 6 hours, straightening her uniform and rolling her shoulders to work out the stiffness that had built up during her long vigil. "That moment is now," and there was steel in her voice that made Chen take an involuntary step backward. The chamber was still in chaos, delegates shouting and threatening, and making accusations that would have started wars under normal circumstances. and none of them noticed the small human woman walking calmly toward the central podium, where only the most powerful speakers were permitted to stand. None of them noticed until she was already there, and then every eye in the room turned to her with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage to something that might have been the first stirrings of fear. The chamber fell silent as Alara stepped up to the central podium, a silence so sudden and complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone present like the calm before a terrible storm. Ambassador Vrex was the first to recover his voice, his mandibles clicking with indignation as he pointed one razor-sharp limb at the small human woman who had dared to claim a space reserved for the leaders of great civilizations. "What is this outrage?" he demanded. "The Terran delegation has no right to speak from the central podium, and they certainly have no right to interrupt a council session that will determine their very survival." "Remove her," Warlord Grin growled, gesturing to the guards who stood at the edges of the room. "She has wasted enough of our time with her silence, and I will not allow her to waste more with whatever pathetic plea she has prepared." The guards, massive Urath warriors in ceremonial armor, began to move toward the podium. But Ilara raised one hand in a gesture so calm and confident that they hesitated, uncertain how to proceed against someone who showed no fear whatsoever. "Forgive my silence," Ilara said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the vast chamber without any apparent effort. "I was waiting for all of you to remember why you actually hate each other." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended over their heads, and for a moment no one seemed to know how to respond to such an unexpected statement. Counselor Mythis recovered first, her serpentine body coiling with irritation as she fixed her cold eyes on the human who had dared to address them as if she were their equal. "You have been sitting in the corner like a frightened child for 6 hours, and now you speak of hatred?" she hissed. "What could a human possibly understand about the relationships between the great powers of the galaxy?" Ilara smiled, and there was something in that smile that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I understand a great deal, Counselor," she replied. "For example, I understand that the Ketvari Collective deployed a biological weapon on the Urath colony world of Thessa 7 approximately 43 years ago, a weapon that killed over 2 million civilians, including children and the elderly." The chamber went completely still, and Ambassador Vrex's compound eyes seemed to bulge outward as he processed what he had just heard. "That is a lie," he spluttered. "The plague on Thessa 7 was a natural occurrence, a tragedy that no one could have prevented." "I have the communications between your predecessor and the Kethvari Biological Weapons Division," Ilara continued calmly, as if she had not heard his denial. "I have the orders authorizing the deployment, the reports confirming the success of the operation, and the subsequent cover-up that blamed the outbreak on contaminated food. Supplies from a human trading vessel." She turned to look directly at Warlord Grin, whose fur had begun to stand on end as rage built behind his eyes like a fire waiting for fuel. "The humans you blamed for the deaths of 2 million Urath citizens were innocent," Ilara told him, "and the Kethvari have allowed you to hate us for their crime for over 4 decades. Grin turned slowly to face Ambassador Vrex, and the look in his eyes was pure murder. "Is this true?" he growled, his voice so low and dangerous that several nearby delegates actually fled their seats to put distance between themselves and the coming explosion. "It is a human trick," Vrex shrieked, his mandibles clicking frantically. "They are trying to divide us with lies and fabrications." But Ilara was not finished, and she turned next to Counselor Mythis with that same calm, deadly smile. "Counselor, would you like me to share the contents of the treaty your hegemony signed with?" "Warlord Grin's predecessor," she asked. "The one that promised Velothine support for a coup against the current government in exchange for control of 3 Urath border systems?" Mythis went pale beneath her scales, her forked tongue flickering nervously as she tried to formulate a response. "How do you know about that?" she demanded, abandoning any pretense of denial in her shock. "I know everything," Alara replied simply. "I know about the assassination the Marathi Collective paid for when the previous Velethine counselor became too demanding. I know about the secret fleet the Kethvari have been building, in violation of 6 different treaties. I know about the genetic experiments the Urith have been conducting on prisoners of war, despite the Galactic Accords forbidding such practices." She produced a small data chip from her pocket, and held it up for all to see. A tiny object that seemed to glow with the light of 1,000 burning secrets. "Contains evidence of every crime, every betrayal, every broken treaty committed by every species in this chamber over the past 300 years, she declared. "There is enough information here to start 4 separate wars and topple at least 6 governments. And I am prepared to release all of it, unless this council agrees to my terms." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the harsh breathing of delegates, who were beginning to understand just how badly they had miscalculated. "This is blackmail," Ambassador Vrex finally managed to say, though his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. "It is leverage," Alara corrected him. "There is a difference, though I understand why it might be hard for you to see it from where you are standing." She lowered the data chip, but did not put it away, keeping it visible as a reminder of the power she now held over all of them. "Let me ask you all a question," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "You came here today expecting to find a weak and frightened species, ready to beg for mercy and accept whatever scraps you chose to throw our way." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of creatures who had ruled the stars for millennia, creatures who had conquered worlds and enslaved entire civilizations, creatures who now looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of genuine fear. "Is this the part where I act like I cannot win?" she asked, and her voice was quiet now, almost gentle, but somehow that made it more terrifying than any shout could have been. No one answered, because no one knew what to say. "I did not think so," Alara concluded, and she stepped back from the podium with a grace that seemed almost leisurely, as if she had all the time in the world and nothing in the universe could threaten her. The coalition that had come to destroy humanity sat in stunned silence. First time in 6 hours, the small human woman who had refused to speak was the only voice that mattered. The aftermath of Ilara's revelation was chaos of an entirely different kind than what had come before. No longer the chaos of predators fighting over prey, but the chaos of prey suddenly realizing they had been hunters all along, and were now trapped in a cage of their own making. Warlord Grin rose from his seat with murder in his eyes, but the target of his rage was no longer the human delegation at the far end of the room. Instead, he turned his massive body toward Ambassador Vrex, with fangs bared and claws extended. 2 million of my people," he growled, his voice shaking with fury barely contained. 2 million innocent lives, and you let us believe it was the humans. You let us hate them for a crime that your filthy species committed. "This is exactly what she wants," Vrex shrieked, backing away from the advancing warlord, with his mandibles clicking in panic. "She is manipulating us, turning us against each other with lies and half-truths." "Are they lies?" Counselor Mythis hissed, her own composure shattered by the revelation of her secret treaty. "Because the human seems to know things that only a handful of beings in the galaxy should know. And I find myself wondering how many other secrets she has been keeping in that little chip of hers." The Marathi delegate, emboldened by the chaos, stood and pointed an accusing finger at the Velethine counselor. "My people in chains for 3 centuries, and now we learn that you have been plotting against your own allies as well," he shouted. "The collective demands independence from the hegemony, and we demand it now." Similar accusations erupted from every corner of the room as species that had come together to destroy humanity now turned on each other with all the venom and hatred that had been building for thousands of years. And Alara watched it all, with the satisfaction of an artist observing a masterpiece. Lieutenant Chen appeared at her side, his face pale, but his eyes bright with a new understanding of what he had witnessed. "Commander, what happens now?" he asked in a whisper. "You have destroyed their coalition, but surely they will eventually realize that fighting each other only benefits humanity." "Eventually, yes," Alara agreed, "but not today, and probably not for many years to come, because the wounds I have opened here are too deep to heal quickly. The trust they once shared, however fragile, is gone forever." She turned to face her aide, with an expression that was almost kind. "This was never about winning a single battle, Lieutenant," she explained. "It was about changing the equation, about showing them that humanity is not a victim to be divided among predators, but a player to be respected and feared." As if to prove her point, Warlord Grin suddenly turned away from Ambassador Vrex and approached the Terran delegation with heavy steps that made the floor tremble beneath his weight. Alara did not flinch, did not step back, did not show any sign of the fear that a sane person might feel when confronted by a 9-foot mountain of muscle and rage. "Human," Grin rumbled, looking down at her with eyes that still burned with fury, but also held something new, something that might have been respect. "You have made enemies today, powerful enemies who will not forget what you have done." "Enemies who were already my enemies," Alara replied calmly. "The only difference is that now they know better than to underestimate my species." Grin stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something that no one in the chamber expected. He laughed, a deep booming sound that seemed to shake the very walls. "The Terran has teeth," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "For 40 years, I have hated your species for a crime they did not commit, and for 6 hours, I have sat in this chamber planning to enslave your people, and yet you sit here without fear and show me the truth that my own allies hid from me." He extended one massive hand toward her, claws retracted, in what Alara recognized as an Urath gesture of grudging respect between warriors. "The Dominion will not join the coalition against humanity," he announced, "and any who wish to challenge this decision may face me in personal combat." No one challenged him. Within the hour, 3 more species had followed the Urath example, declaring their intention to negotiate trade agreements with the Terran Confederacy, rather than participate in its destruction. And 2 others had requested what they called intelligence-sharing partnerships, which was diplomatic language for, "Please do not reveal our secrets, and we will cooperate with whatever you want." The Kethvari delegation left in humiliated silence, their plans for biological research on human subjects abandoned, along with their dreams of easy conquest. And Ambassador Vrex did not look back as he scuttled through the door with his guards surrounding him like a protective shell. Counselor Mythis lingered longer, her serpentine eyes fixed on Alara, with an expression that was impossible to read. "You have won today, human," she said quietly, "but the game is far from over, and the hegemony has a long memory." "So does humanity," Alara replied, "and our memory is longer than yours." The counselor held her gaze for a moment longer, and then she turned and slithered away without another word, leaving the chamber that had been meant to witness humanity's downfall, now bearing witness to its triumph instead. As the room slowly emptied, Lieutenant Chen let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 hours. "Commander, you bluffed them," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "Half of that data on your chip must have been incomplete or unverified, and you could not have actually proven most of what you claimed." Alara slipped the chip back into her pocket with a slight smile. "They did not know that," she replied, "and by the time they figure it out, if they ever do, the damage will already be done, because the seeds of doubt I planted today will grow into forests of suspicion that will keep them fighting each other for generations." She walked toward the viewport at the far end of the chamber, where the light of the stars awaited. Distant stars painted patterns across the floor, and Chen followed her in respectful silence. "Humans learned something a long time ago, Lieutenant," she said, gazing out at the vast darkness of space that had almost been taken from her species. "You do not need the biggest gun, or the largest fleet, or the most advanced technology to win. You just need everyone else to believe that you might pull the trigger." She turned to face him, and there was something ancient and knowing in her eyes, something that spoke of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars, and had emerged stronger each time. "They mocked me for sitting quietly," she murmured, and a smile crossed her face that was sharp enough to cut. "They always do." She looked back out at the stars that now belonged to humanity as much as they belonged to anyone. "That is usually their first mistake," she said, "and today I made sure it will be their last." Council stood empty now, silent except for the soft hum of ancient machinery. But the echoes of what had happened within its walls would reverberate across the galaxy for centuries to come. And the species who had gathered to destroy humanity would never again make the mistake of underestimating the small and quiet creatures from the pale blue world called Earth.